The title of my talk is Bird Diversity in Space and Time, but in fact, I will speak mostly about spatial patterns of bird diversity. So my major question I will focus on will be why some places are more species rich, more diverse than other places. In the end, I will show that to understand properly the spatial patterns in diversity, we need to know something also about temporal dynamics. So that's the reason why I have the time in the title. But I will focus on something like this. Here, this is very famous map, or some version of the map is something you probably have seen already, of bird diversity across the Earth. The redder areas means higher species richness. This is map in the scale or grain of about 100 times 100 kilometers, 1 degrees latitude and longitude. And you can see that in some places the species richness of birds can reach many hundreds of species, whereas in some places it's only I don't know, 50 or something like this. So there are some pronounced pattern. Most importantly, the species richness or diversity is concentrated in the tropics, but even within the tropics, it is not equally distributed, and you can see something, I will speak about it a little bit more later, that the highest diversity of birds is in tropical mountains. So we have latitudinal diversity gradient. The diversity of birds decreases from the equator to the poles. The problem is that there are dozens of hypotheses explaining this latitudinal diversity gradient. This is just a list from our relatively recent paper where we wanted to kind of summarize the major hypotheses which are still not dead, I would say, which are still in a sense valid, but still there is about 15 hypotheses speaking about the role of temperature, productivity, rainfall, habitat heterogeneity, stability of the environment, seasonality of the environment, and so on. So many hypotheses. When we started to study, or when people started to study the latitudinal diversity gradient, the natural first step was to narrow down the hypothesis by looking on the general correlates of species richness, to have a look what are the major environmental factors which really correlate very well with species richness. And it turned out there were several papers, including this our paper, which basically found out typically that diversity is high in the mountains, is high in warmer areas, and is high in regions with high environmental productivity, basically the amount of resources. The problem is that whereas the mountains are somehow independent on temperature or productivity, the regions where you have mountains basically do not correlate with the regions of high productivity or of temperature. This is not the case for these two variables, which are typically very closely correlated. So it was in the beginning hard to say whether temperature is really crucial for bird diversity or productivity. Only recently we studied species richness patterns or diversity patterns, how they are related to temperature and productivity, and try to compare the role of these two variables. And to make long story short, we have found that productivity is more consistent predictor of diversity. There are several arguments for it. One of them is that if you study different groups of, let's say in this case birds, you can see that the species temperature relationship is sometimes positive but sometimes even negative, and it's really not consistent, whereas the relationship between diversity and productivity is much more consistent. And more importantly, temperature drives species richness of birds only if temperature is positively correlated to productivity, whereas this is not the case for productivity. Productivity is a consistent driver of diversity regardless of the role of temperature. So generally we can say that if we ask what is the single predictor of species richness, it is environmental productivity. you can see that a relationship between number of bird species and AET, actual evapotranspiration, which is some surrogate of productivity, is quite nice. It is quite nicely related, and you can also see that the spatial patterns of diversity and AET are kind of similar to each other. However, it does not mean that we know what drives the relationship between productivity and diversity. Basically, we moved from one pattern, which is, let's say, latitudinal diversity gradient, to another pattern, which is the relationship between diversity and productivity, the amount of resources. So we can ask now not what drives latitudinal diversity gradient, probably productivity, and you will see that it is kind of reliable point. But we now need to ask why there are more species in more productive environment. And even though it may look at the first glance as kind of simple, of course there are more resources, so there should be more species. It is in fact not that simple, and most of the time I will be speaking about this question: why higher productivity drives higher bird diversity. Almost 20 years ago, I realized one thing, that we can recover patterns of bird diversity by a simple geographic model, which basically assumes that species have some ranges, species spread in space. And if we assume that this spreading is modulated by productivity, so that the species spread with higher probability to more productive environment, we can recover many patterns in bird diversity. So the idea of the model is that the species starts to spread from one cell along this productivity gradient. Again, the redder means higher productivity. And even the initial position is dependent on productivity level. And in the next step, it can spread anywhere to the neighboring cells, but with proportionally higher probability to more productive regions. So in the next step, you have these two cells, and again, in the next step, you can spread to any of these adjoint cells, but again, with the probability which is proportional to productivity. So you can model it in a relatively simple process. You simply broaden or spread the species range, and in every step also the set of possible cells where the species can spread increases, but always in every step productivity drives the probability of spreading of the species. Very simple model. In fact, this model does need only two input information. First is the productivity levels or productivity values for the grid cells across the Earth. And the second is that you need the distribution of range sizes of species, in this case, bird species. And it turned out that such a simple model actually predicts the diversity patterns of birds pretty well. It is able to explain about 60% of spatial variation of diversity. It explains major difference between biogeographic realms. So, for example, why there are more species in Africa and even more in neotropics than in Palearctic. It can be very well explained by this simple model. You can see that the relationship between predicted and observed species richness is pretty nice. And importantly, it also explains very nicely the latitudinal diversity gradient itself. These red cells are predictions based on this simple model, and not the red cells, the red dots, and blue dots are real observation. So far, so good. However, you see that there is still, first, there is still big variation, and second, it is hard to say what biological processes actually the model kind of encompasses, right? Because it is really simple probabilistic process which does not account for evolution and so on. If we have a look again on the map of species richness, you see this kind of structured patterns, but if we have a look on predictions of the models, they are much more smoother, obviously. And it makes sense because it assumes contiguous species ranges which spread randomly, only modulated by the productivity. But why I'm showing it is that we can compare these two maps and basically calculate residuals from the model predictions. So basically the values which are higher or lower than predicted by the model. And if we plot these residuals, we see very clear pattern. Basically, the residuals are driven by the mountains. Yeah? So if we account for the effect of productivity, mountains drive species richness. And it is very strong, you know, Andes, these Central Asian mountains, Himalayas, this Eastern African ridge, basically is a mountain chain going down there to the Drakensberg mountain. It's very clear. So besides the effect of productivity, which I will be talking about later, there is strong effect of mountains. And if you think about it, it is not that surprising. There are several reasons why mountains have higher species richness than what would be accounted for by productivity. Mountains can be species rich because there is higher speciation rate. Speciation is often allopatric speciation, where when the species is split into two populations which do not communicate genetically to each other, and the mountains represent the barriers which promote allopatric speciation. There can be also a lower extinction rate. There are several interesting papers which show that mountains have acted as refugia during climatic oscillations, especially these glacial oscillations during the Quaternary. And there are two reasons for it. One is that mountains have relatively low so-called climate velocity. It basically means that if climate changes in mountains, you can shift up or down, and basically you are still in your climatic niche. Whereas in lowlands, if the climate changes, you often cannot find your climate, or you can find by moving by thousands of kilometers. That's one thing. So in the mountains, you can just move down and up, and you will still persist there. The other reason is that in the mountains, there can be lower extinction rates simply due to the fact that mountains are more humid. And it is especially crucial during the Ice Age, when most of the water was included in the glaciers, and consequently it was very arid climate, and any humidity had a positive role. Yeah? So there are good reasons why the mountains have this effect. However, we need to go back to this effect of productivity, which is, as I said, not that trivial. It was quite popular in last 2 decades to try to recover diversity patterns, not only in birds, but in birds quite a lot, by recovering the diversification histories using phylogenetic trees. So, for example, one consequent hypothesis says that mountains that productive environments have higher diversity because they lead to higher diversification rate. Yeah? They promote speciation for some reason. The problem is that this hypothesis basically completely failed, and it turns out more and more that in fact, if we study diversification rates, they often appear highest not in the most diverse environment, but typically in the least diverse. Yeah? So, for example, if we study diversification rates of various group of birds, this is from a study done by my former student, he found out that highest diversification is always away from the tropics, not in the tropics. And there is negative relationship between regional species richness and rate of diversification. And more and more papers have shown exactly this pattern, that diversification is not related to diversity. Another explanation of diversity pattern related to productivity would be that the tropics, or generally more productive environment, was older, more stable, and maybe bigger. Yeah? So this is sometimes called time and era hypothesis. Sometimes it is whereas this first hypothesis is like named as the tropics is a cradle because it generates species. This is tropics as a museum, which means that it may not have higher diversification rate, but there is lower extinction rate and more species, or species have time to accumulate in the areas which are actually old and stable. The problem is that when we have a look on patterns of diversification across the globe, in contrast to patterns of diversity, they look very messy. Here, this is patterns of diversity in passerines. You can see that it is very similar to the diversity of all birds, which makes sense because passerines represent more than half of all bird species. But if you have a look on diversification rate, the higher diversification rate, it looks messy. However, it does not look that messy if you realize one important thing, and it is that passerines originated in this area, in basically Austro-Asian region. And you can see that in the area where the passerines originated, their diversification rate is actually quite low, whereas in areas which were colonized later, the diversification rate is quite high. But in the end, the diversity patterns are independent on it, right? So there is high diversity in both low diversification regions where the birds originated, and high, basically, again, high diversity is in the regions which were occupied later, and this diversity was basically created by rapid recent diversification. So this realization that the diversity is decoupled from the diversification, but still it ends up in consistent patterns, not only among continents, but also among different groups, led to another idea. I will kind of speak a bit more, and it is the idea that productivity actually kind of affects or represent given carrying capacity for species richness. Or the idea is that different regions have different carrying capacity for species richness. And according to these patterns I have shown to you are actually quite consistent with this idea, because if there is some high carrying capacity for the tropics, for example, this capacity was reached relatively soon in the region where the best passerines originated. So it is not surprising that there is low recent diversification rate, because it was already saturated by species, right? Whereas new regions, in new regions, there is high diversification simply because it was colonized later and it still kind of needs to be filled. In fact, I spent last 10 years or something by exploring this idea of the carrying capacity for species richness. Because you can say, okay, there is some capacity for given species richness. In the tropics, the capacity is apparently or probably higher. But what drives this capacity? How the diversity limits actually emerge? And I will speak about a little bit more developed theory in the end, but the simplest way how productivity could limit species richness is via so-called more individuals hypothesis, which is depicted here. Basically, it says that energy availability determines total number of individuals of given taxon. Yeah? So in the tropics, you can have many individuals of birds across all species. And higher number of individuals leads to higher species richness, simply because it can promote or maintain more species with viable populations. In other words, if you have total number of individuals, you cannot have too many species, because the species would have so small populations that they would go very soon extinct. Yeah? So basic idea is the low productivity means smaller total community size, and if you have low total community size in terms of number of individuals, you cannot have too many species because they would have too small populations. You can even formalize it a little bit more, and by saying that for given environment, if you increase the number of species, the extinction rate must necessarily increase, simply because if the total amount of resources is limited, adding more and more species means that the species must have smaller and smaller populations, so their total extinction rate, which is driven by population size, increases. And it increases up to the point where it is balanced by origination rate. Origination rate may be or may not be dependent on the number of species. And then if we have two environments, let's say one tropical, one temperate. In the tropical environment, the increase of extinction rate with number of species is not that steep, simply because you can still have, because there is a lot of resources and you can still have large populations. So this is a relatively straightforward way how productivity could affect diversity patterns. The problem is, however, whether it really plays a role, whether really number of individuals is limited by availability, and whether species richness is limited by the total number of individuals. The problem is that many authors, including us in some previous papers, have shown that in fact there is a close relationship between productivity and species richness, but not that nice relationship between productivity and number of individuals. Number of individuals does not vary with productivity too much, and it seems to be relatively decoupled from it. And also the relationship between number of individuals and species richness is surprisingly worse than the direct relationship between productivity and species richness. So to understand the diversity limits, it is necessary to understand what are the links between species diversity of birds and numbers of individuals, abundances. And we were not very happy with the data available, so we decided to collect our own data. And as a model system, we used South Africa, because South Africa has one great advantage. There is nice productivity gradient going from the west to the east, which is completely orthogonal to temperature gradient, which obviously goes from the north to the south. Yeah? So here in South Africa, generally, productivity gradient is kind of clean, poor. You know, it's not kind of combined with temperature gradient. And you can see that bird diversity, bird species richness is really, the pattern of bird species richness is very similar to pattern of productivity here measured by some vegetation index. It's not that important. So number of bird species increases with NDVI, with measure of productivity. However, some preliminary data based on basically atlas collections of this bird records shown that actually mean reporting rate of species does not increase with productivity. So we were really interested what are the patterns of not only of diversity but also of abundances along this productivity gradient. And for this reason we did a field research along this productivity gradient. You can see now here what actually how the productivity changes look like in the landscape. Basically, we go from the Namib Desert through Kalahari, which is not a desert but an arid savanna, to some humid savannas. And we did several expeditions to the whole area. First two expeditions went to Republic of South Africa, and the other expedition went to Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe and counted birds there. The method was very simple. We had together 30 big transects. Of every transect has 32 mapping points. They were 1 kilometer apart, which also meant that the whole transect had 32 kilometers, which is a comparable scale to the scale of these basic grid cells in the atlases, which is quite important. And in every point we counted birds for 20 minutes. Some points were actually resampled and so on. And this is the data, the data set we have. And now what we have found, the first result can be seen already simple from the numbers. I will show you then obviously some graphs, but this is, for me, even this is quite interesting. You can see here these are numbers of total number of all birds across the whole 32-point transect, which we can call gamma diversity. These are these black numbers, and these gray numbers are numbers of local mean diversity in every point. And you can see that really the humid savannas have about 100 or 90 to 100 species in the whole transect. But surprisingly, the highest local diversity is not in the most humid, the green mean really high productivity, not in the most productive environments, but actually somewhere in the middle. You can see, for example, here local number of species is 20, here it's 19, but here is not that much. If you plot it into the graph, you can see that the pattern is quite strong, that the gamma diversity, the diversity of the bird diversity of the whole transect increases basically monotonically with productivity. But local diversity does not. It is highest somewhere in the middle of the diversity gradient. I deliberately plot the species richness in logarithmic scale here. And the reason is very simple, because if we plot it in logarithmic scale, then the distance between these two curves, or between particle points here, corresponds to beta diversity. The reason is very simple. Basically, this is the difference in logarithm, and you may remember that if the difference of the two logarithms is equal to logarithm of the ratio. So basically, this distance corresponds to the classical Whittaker index of beta diversity, which is gamma over alpha. Basically, if we have 100 species in gamma, and like for the whole transect, and 20 species per 1 point, then beta diversity is 5, because it is 5 times higher gamma diversity than alpha diversity. So it is not that surprising that if we plot beta diversity along this productivity gradient, lowest beta diversity is here, because it corresponds to the actually lowest distance between these two curves. And now what happens with the abundances? It kind of mirrors the beta diversity patterns. The total abundance, community abundances are very low in Namib Desert, in deserts in general, then increase, and then either saturate or even go down slightly in the most productive parts of the gradient, where there is actually highest species gamma diversity. So it is relatively interesting that the gamma diversity, total number of species, increases quite smoothly with productivity, but local diversity not, and local abundance also does not. In fact, these two patterns indicate two things. First thing is that apparently increase of species richness along productivity gradient is not mediated by increasing abundances, because here you have highest diversity, but not the highest abundances. And importantly, these two patterns mirror each other because they are mathematically related. I'm not going to the details, but the basic idea is that the rarer are species in average, the higher is beta diversity. Yeah, this is from some older papers where we were dealing really with these geometrical issues. Again, not going to the details, but if mean population size is large, the beta diversity is low, and vice versa. Why is this important? Because we can interpret the patterns along the productivity gradient as follows. Basically, here you increase productivity, and whereas gamma diversity increases, total abundances do not increase, which means that in the middle of the gradient, there is the highest abundance for given number of species, so that actually there are the individual populations are largest. Here they are small because because basically in the desert you have low abundances, and here the mean population sizes are also small because you have higher total abundances, but at the same time you have many species, so abundance per species is again small. But in the middle it is relatively high, and it corresponds to, this Kalahari Desert corresponds to regions where you have high local diversity, relatively high abundances, which means that that mean population sizes are large, and low beta diversity. So kind of these patterns go to each other, like the differences in local and regional diversity and abundances. The problem is, however, that still we don't know why we observe this, right? We can reformulate the question and ask why actually we see this pattern. Why the total abundances do not increase so that local species richness would also increase correspondingly. So what we observed along the productivity gradient in southern Africa is that whereas total species richness increases, local species richness is highest in the middle of the gradient, and local abundances are also high there. So why there are lower species richness in most productive areas in South Africa? That's the question we ask, and honestly we do not have clear answer to it. We can speculate about higher seasonality or unpredictability of resources in these most humid savannas with low species richness, but we haven't found any evidence for it. We can think about some low nutrient content in lower trophic levels, but again, we didn't find any evidence for it. And when we explored actually patterns of insect abundances along the productivity gradient, it is relatively monotonic. So we do not see any evidence that there will be low amount of resources in the humid savanna. The hypothesis or the explanation I'm still kind of happy with, or which at least we were not able to reject, is that in fact, and it is related to the observation we did in the humid savannas, in fact, the species, maybe I will show you this first, species there are very strongly like confined to rivers and their surroundings. So maybe, in fact, the total abundance is negatively related to variation coefficient of alpha diversity. Basically, it means that if there is high variance in local diversity, which is driven by the fact that most species are just around the rivers and do not go away from the rivers, and that's what we observe in these humid savannas, the total abundances are low. So one option would be that the selection pressure on specialization actually acts to lowering population sizes because their resources are stable and they are located basically around the rivers. Or in other words, and I still would like to stress that it is a speculation, the species there in a humid savanna, in contrast to Kalahari, let's say, do not need large populations because their resources are relatively stable around the rivers, and it is sufficient, and they can live with small populations which still do not go extinct. Anyway, regardless of whether this speculation or this explanation of this weird pattern along the productivity gradient in South Africa, it means that the links between community size or total community abundance and species richness are more complex. Definitely, we can reject the more individuals hypothesis in its simplest version. Diversity is not driven by the total number of individuals. So we can ask now, how is it possible, or what drives this? Diversity limits, if we believe that diversity really is limited by the productivity, if it is not driven simply by limiting total number of individuals. And to do it properly, and now I'm going to the field which is more abstract, but it will be only the final few slides concerning concerning, we need to go a little bit more to the theory, and this is the theory we're working on in last 10 years, sorry. 10 days would be nice, but the overall idea of the theory is that the theory should really account for the linkage between species abundances and species richness. So, and for this reason, we cannot use some already established theory like the neutral theory, which kind of nicely comprises diversity dynamics, but it assumes that total abundances are basically given by the environment, and they are just determined, and they vary only according to the environment. Yeah, so basically it is like a priori input into the theory, but we do not want abundances as input. We need also predict them. And also we were not able to use some community-based theories based on some vague assumptions about the relationship between extinction, speciation, and so on, simply because we do not know too much a priori about these lines or these functions. So we created what we called equilibrium theory of biodiversity dynamics, and the basic unit of the theory is a species. And the theory is in the end it is mathematically complex, but the idea is very simple. First is that we still didn't want to completely abandon the idea of abundances driving the diversity equilibria. So we assume that extinction and origination rates are abundance dependent. Basically, when population size is too small, extinction rate is higher than origination rate. And if the population size of individual species is large, then origination rate, speciation rate, let's say, is larger than extinction. And this is very important, and it is very simple assumption which is actually made by many other ecological theories, but it has an important consequence. There is a mean population size which is like equilibrium size. You know, if total species populations are too big, they originate more rapidly than they go extinct. If they are too small, for example, because you have limited number of individuals and many species, they go extinct basically faster than is their origination rate. So there is some equilibrium population size. And it has an important, by the way, it does not matter whether how origination rate depends on population size. There is all, unless it is steeper, this curve is steeper than the extinction curve. But anyway, it means that if you plot species richness and community abundance against each other, the equilibrium population size lies on this diagonal. And if the community, let's say community of birds in Kalahari, or in Africa, if it is somewhere here, there is many species but low community abundance, so extinction is higher than origination, and you have a tendency to go back to this diagonal. And here, if you have large abundances and low species richness, it have a tendency to go to this direction. So this is the equilibrium diagonal, which is characteristic for the community. You cannot have two small populations. Or you can, but then you go extinct, right? You go back. And if you have large populations, it is also not an equilibrium situation because origination is higher than extinction and the species richness increases. And now the question is where the abundance lies. One option would be that abundance is totally driven by the environment, and this is the assumptions by many diversity dynamics theories. But we felt that it is better to assume actually that community abundance itself is driven by the species themselves, by the birds, right? So it is not driven simply by the environment. Let's say this environment, this tropical forest or savanna has this particular total community abundance. No, we are saying that more species means actually better utilization of the resources. So that in the end, actually higher species richness means higher community abundance. up to some Jmax, or it is like the maximum community abundance, which is determined by the resources. Why am I speaking in such a detail about this theory? The reason is that if this is the case, if there is not only limit on species richness given by total abundance, but also species richness itself affect abundances by affecting population dynamics of all species and so on, then there are three parameters which affect diversity equilibria, and consequently three major factors which affect diversity patterns in general. One is this maximum attainable number of individuals, which is given by productivity. The second is the shape of this curve, which determines how species utilize their resources. So if there are different sets of species with different abilities to utilize resources, the curve would look different. For example, the curve would look different for carnivorous species than for herbivorous and so on. And the third is the equilibrium mean abundance, which is here, which is given by these curves concerning origination and extinction, which drives basically the slope of this curve. And this is very important because it means that there are principally three factors which affect equilibrium species richness and, as I believe, also resulting spatial patterns of diversity. One is resource level. Basically, this is the classical effect of the number of individuals. If there is lower productivity, you cannot reach this equilibrium and you are somewhere lower. But if this is the case, species richness should be proportional to community abundance, because they should, if nothing else changes, then the resource level, then we should expect proportionality. More species and more individuals are proportional to each other. More individuals means always more species, but this is what we do not observe typically, as I shown in this African case. The other option, how the equilibrium diversity can change, is due to the changing origination or extinction rate, which changes this slope of this line. And you can see that in such a case, species richness would not be proportional to community abundance. And the third option is that, as I mentioned, if you have different sets of species which utilize resources differently, you can have different curve relating community abundance to species richness. You can have different equilibria and even some unstable equilibria. I'm not going to speak about it, but I think it is important to realize that this is probably, for birds at least, the most kind of realistic scenario, because we do not see proportionality between species richness and abundance, but we see the effects of changing parameters which can be assumed that they affect origination and extinction rate. And this is the last paper I want to, or the last results I want to show you. Based on these ideas, that it is not only about the amount of resources, but about their stability. We tested the prediction that diversity should be affected not only by the total amount of resources productivity, but also by its variation. And the variation can be decomposed to various dimensions like seasonality or unpredictability. And again, to make a long story short, we have shown that at least for the most productive regions, the strongest effect on diversity is actually unpredictability of this like resource level, basically these green areas. The higher unpredictability means lower species richness. And when we made some variation partitioning, it turned out really that productivity does not have even any sole independent effect. There is zero variation explained only by variation in productivity. But there is large shared effect with seasonality and unpredictability, but unpredictability actually has the strongest effect. So definitely species richness patterns, I started with stating that they are driven by productivity, but no, they are not. If we go into that, we see that the predictability is important. So it's not only about resources, but about their stability, which changes extinction rate, and consequently the relationships between species richness and community abundance are not proportional. So, to sum up, you can see that large-scale diversity patterns are associated generally in the broadest picture by variation in topography and productivity. This is pretty clear. Basically, global diversity patterns are well explained by combination of productivity and mountains, basically. Also, this is kind of supported by the fact that the simple model of productivity modulated range dynamics explains the latitudinal diversity gradient very well, and the residual variation is clearly linked to mountains. However, diversity productivity relationship is not driven by diversification rates. The diversification rates seem to be decoupled from diversity patterns, which somehow supports the idea of carrying capacity for species richness or some diversity equilibria which are independent on exact rates. These equilibria, however, are not driven simply according to more individual hypotheses by total community size. Not at all. Community size in terms of total abundance is relatively decoupled from diversity patterns, and even though total community size participates in this negative feedback, in this equilibria, it does not drive apparently the diversity patterns because relationship between diversity and abundances are more complex and scale dependent, as you could see from this case study in Southern Africa. And the reason is that community abundance is not something independent, but it is itself driven by the community dynamics. And according to what we kind of explore, according to all the things when we try to put them together, it seems that besides resource abundance, their long-term stability seems to be crucial in driving bird diversity patterns. Thank you.